Dawn broke over northern France on August 17, 1943, with the air already trembling from the roar of engines. The morning sky above the fields of Saint-Nazaire was bruised with storm clouds and contrails, streaks of white that tangled and dissolved in the rising sun. Below them, farmers clutched the earth as the thunder of war shook the soil from their hands. Overhead, nearly 200 American B-17 flying fortresses pushed eastward, heavy with bombs, their silver skins glinting like the armored scales of a giant serpent in the sky. U.S. Army Air Force's mission report, AUG 1943. The Luftwaffe came at them fast, slicing through the clouds like hawks diving on prey. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s slashed at the bomber streams in coordinated packs, their 20mm cannons tearing through the air with vicious precision. The Americans expected losses. They always did. The cost of daylight bombing was high, and the doctrine was merciless. Hold formation, keep the box tight, trust the overlapping fire of 50 caliber guns to ward off the hunters. But this day was different. As smoke poured from the wings of one fortress, its left engine ablaze, German pilots tightened their attack pattern, convinced they had scored a certain kill. Yet the bomber refused to fall. Shuddering, coughing flames, it clung to formation. Chunks of aluminum sheared away in the slipstream. A section of its wing, nearly half, was gone, shredded by cannon shells. Still, it stayed aloft, lumbering forward, a wounded giant refusing to yield. Bundesarchiv pilot logbook entry. Radio chatter from the German side captured disbelief. Unmöglich. It should be falling. It is still flying, one pilot barked, his voice jagged with confusion. For men trained to believe in the precision of their weapons and the fragility of enemy machines, the sight was maddening. Their rounds had torn apart dozens of Soviet and British bombers. Why did these American machines not die the same way? To the men inside the fortress, the world was a storm of noise and fire. Oxygen masks hissed as the crew gasped in the thin, freezing air above 20,000 feet. Hydraulic lines spat fluid across the radio operator's station. Yet the ball turret gunner, his legs crammed into the glass bubble beneath the belly, still fired bursts into the swarming German fighters. The pilot's gloved hands gripped the yoke with steady fury, straining to hold course. Inside the fuselage, wounded men bled onto steel decking that was rattling loose from its bolts. And still, the bomber endured. The Americans had dubbed the B-17 the Flying Fortress, but for German engineers watching wreckage photographs pile up, the name was no longer propaganda. It was an infuriating truth. Aircraft riddled with cannon fire, their fuselages punched through with holes wide enough for a man to crawl through, still managed to cross the channel, stagger over English soil and land in flames, alive. Against all reason, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. By mid-1943, the air war over Europe had become a contest not just of numbers but of endurance. Germany still fielded experienced fighter groups, and their industry churned out interceptors as fast as Allied bombers could be built. Yet attrition was mounting. The Luftwaffe was forced to confront squadrons of machines that, time and again, refused to die in the sky. Pilots described it as shooting at walls of iron, a grim acknowledgement that the balance of air power might tilt not because of speed or numbers, but because of engineering resilience. This resilience was not born overnight. In 1934, when Boeing engineers first submitted their Model 299 prototype, critics scoffed. 4 engines, all-metal skin, enormous payload. It was an aircraft too ambitious, too heavy, too costly for mass production. Yet Boeing's designers, Edward Curtis Wells and a team of dedicated engineers, pushed through. They overbuilt the frame, layering stress-tested aluminum alloys, reinforcing spars, and ensuring that the wings could survive punishment beyond what most strategists considered realistic. Boeing Engineering Division Report, 1935. Their gamble birthed a bomber that would not only fly far and carry heavy loads, but, crucially, survive what should have been mortal wounds. By the summer of 1943, that gamble was paying off in blood and steel. The U.S. 8th Air Force had grown to more than 1,000 operational bombers in England. Each fortress carried a crew of 10 men, bound by discipline and doctrine, to the rigid geometry of the combat box formation. The overlapping arcs of 13 heavy machine guns made the box a porcupine bristling with steel quills. Losses were still severe. On some missions, 1 in 4 bombers never returned. But what unnerved the Germans most was the sheer number of crippled B-17s that clawed their way home, their bellies scraping English soil in emergency landings. U.S. Army Air Force's Statistical Digest. 1945. On the ground, British and American mechanics marveled at the wrecks. B-17s rolled into dispersal fields with tails shredded, nose cones gone, engines dangling from torn nacelles, and yet crews stumbled out alive. Photographs circulated across air bases. One fortress with its entire vertical stabilizer missing, another with a gaping hole blown through the fuselage large enough for a jeep to pass through. German intelligence analysts intercepting these reports struggled to explain the phenomenon. Was it propaganda? Or had American engineers created something truly beyond expectation? Luftwaffe Technical Interrogation Report, 1943. The truth was more unsettling for the Axis than they imagined. For every fortress destroyed, 2 more seemed to rise, and half of those written off as certain kills somehow limped home. Each survivor carried not just bombs but also a message. The industrial might of America could produce machines too stubborn to die, and men willing to fly them into fire. As the war stretched into its bloodiest phase, one question lingered among German pilots and engineers alike. How much damage could a B-17 take before it finally surrendered to gravity? Their cannons had already shredded wings and torn fuselages apart. Yet the flying fortress refused to vanish from the skies. The answer to that question, the secret that explained why American bombers kept flying, with half their wings gone, lay not only in brute engineering but in a hidden advantage that the Germans had overlooked, and it would be revealed in the battles to come. September 6, 1943. The airfields of Cambridgeshire trembled as crews readied for another deep strike into the German heartland. Mechanics clanged wrenches against steel. Ground crews loaded belts of 50 caliber rounds into Browning machine guns, and armorers hoisted 500-pound bombs into cavernous bays. Pilots checked controls, hands steady but eyes haunted by yesterday's losses. The mission would send more than 300 B-17 flying fortresses into the skies above Stuttgart, deep into Luftwaffe territory. U.S. Army Air Force's Mission Report, Sept 1943. What the Germans did not yet grasp was that the bombers they stalked carried with them a hidden advantage, an engineering philosophy woven into every rivet, every spar, every ounce of alloy. These aircraft had been designed not to fly flawlessly, but to fail gracefully. Boeing's engineers, led by Edward Curtis Wells, had insisted on structural redundancy from the very first blueprints. Dual hydraulic lines snaked through opposite sides of the fuselage. Cables controlling elevators and rudders were routed in parallel paths, so if one was severed, the other could still respond. Fuel tanks were self-sealing, lined with rubber that swelled upon contact with gasoline, choking leaks that might otherwise ignite into infernos. Technical Manual TM 9154, 1942. The fortress was in essence a machine that assumed it would be shot at and was built to keep flying anyway. Armor plating shielded the cockpit and critical systems, but it was the vast strength of the airframe that astonished enemy engineers. The wing spars, massive beams of duralumin alloy, were designed to absorb punishment far beyond commercial standards. Tests at Boeing's Seattle plant showed wings flexing under incredible strain without snapping. Overbuilt, critics sneered in 1935. By 1943, those same design decisions meant that a fortress could lose half a wing's surface area and still generate enough lift to drag itself home. Boeing Structural Test Report, 1935. For the Germans, this defiance was infuriating. Their 20mm and 30mm cannons were devastating against British Wellingtons or Soviet P-2s, often shredding them with a single burst. Yet against the B-17, even multiple strikes sometimes failed. Pilots like Oberleutnant Hans Meyer described the experience. We hit it again and again. Holes opened like doors across its wings. And still it kept its course. We thought the Americans had built aircraft from iron. Part of the answer lay in the crew themselves. 10 men, each trained not merely to perform their role but to improvise when catastrophe struck. Waist gunners doubled as fire suppression crews, hauling extinguishers to douse flames mid-flight. Engineers crawled through wing roots to patch ruptured fuel lines with tape and rags. Radio men relayed damage reports while also splicing severed cables with bare hands, frostbitten fingers, working in sub-zero air at 25,000 feet. Crew after-action debrief, Oct. 1943. The Stuttgart raid would test all of these features to their breaking point. The bombers crossed the channel just after 0800 hours, climbing into formation. At 20,000 feet, the Luftwaffe struck. Dozens of Bf-109s and Fw-190s tore into the American boxes, firing from head-on where defensive fire was weakest. Explosions blossomed as fortresses were ripped apart. Yet others, mortally wounded in appearance, refused to drop from the sky. One B-17, later nicknamed Blondie's Revenge, took hits that shredded its right wing, leaving jagged edges flapping like torn paper. Still, the pilot held formation, bomb bay doors opening as if in defiance. U.S. Army Air Force's mission report, Sep 1943. Flak added to the storm. Over Stuttgart, black puffs burst in lethal clusters, each explosion sending shards of steel tearing into fuselages. Crews heard the thunderous clangs as fragments slammed against armor plates, watched holes appear in their wings as daylight pierced through. Yet bombs were dropped, factories shook, and smoke billowed from burning industrial sites below. German Civil Defense Report, Sep 1943. The fortress that staggered home with half a wing missing became the stuff of legend. Its crew later testified that the right wing spar had been nearly severed, the outer aileron gone, and one engine destroyed. Engineers counted more than 180 holes punched through its skin. And yet, guided by redundant systems and sheer determination, the aircraft limped across the channel and crash-landed on an English field. Photographs circulated across Allied and Axis commands alike. Air Ministry Damage Report 1943. German intelligence officers could scarcely believe the reports. Engineers pored over wreckage photos, shaking their heads. No other bomber would have returned from such wounds, one Luftwaffe technical officer admitted in interrogation after the war. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Interrogation Transcript, 946. The resilience of the fortress was no longer myth. It was a measurable, terrifying advantage. Technical specifications fueled this advantage. Each B-17 carried up to 4,000 pounds of bombs on long-range missions, while maintaining a maximum range of 2,000 miles. Its cruising speed of 150-160 miles at high altitude was slow compared to fighters, but its ceiling of over 30,000 feet placed it beyond the reach of most flak batteries. U.S. Army Air Force's Pilot Training Manual, 1943. With 1350 caliber machine guns mounted in nose, tail, dorsal, ventral, and waist positions, the bomber bristled with defensive firepower. Yet it was the structural engineering, the redundancy, the overbuilt frame, that made the difference between life and death. Factories across America made this resilience possible. In Seattle, Boeing churned out airframes with assembly line precision. In Douglas and Lockheed plants, subcontractors built fuselage sections and wings, each tested for tolerance before shipment. The famed Rosie the Riveters drilled and fastened thousands of rivets daily, their work ensuring that no seam would fail under fire. War Production Board Report, 1943. These anonymous workers, engineers, and inspectors were as critical to the survival of the bomber as the gunners who fired from its windows. The Germans recognized the threat. Their fighter doctrine began to shift. Pilots were ordered to close in dangerously close before firing to ensure maximum impact. New 30mm Mk128 cannons were rushed into production, capable of destroying a fortress with a handful of hits, if those hits landed squarely on engines or cockpits. Yet even these brutal weapons sometimes failed when strikes ripped through wings or fuselages, but left redundant systems intact. Luftwaffe Armament Evaluation, 1944. The Stuttgart mission alone cost the Americans nearly 45 bombers lost. Hundreds of men were killed or captured. Yet more than 250 bombers returned, some trailing smoke, others missing sections of wing or tail. For the German defenders, the sight was chilling. Even when they tore apart formations, too many of the fortresses refused to die. The legend of the indestructible bomber spread through both camps. For Allied crews, it was a source of grim hope, proof that even when their fortress became a flaming wreck, survival was still possible. For the Germans, it was a nightmare made of aluminum and steel, a machine that absorbed their fury and kept flying, an enemy that seemed to mock their weapons with sheer resilience. By the winter of 1943, it was clear the B-17 was more than a bomber. It was a psychological weapon, one that drained German confidence with every crippled aircraft that limped back to England. But its true impact would not only be measured in damaged airframes and shaken pilots, it would reverberate across entire campaigns, reshaping strategy, morale, and the very psychology of the war. And in the months ahead, as the bombers returned again and again, the legacy of their resilience would carve deep scars into the German war machine. The Fouet, winter skies over Europe in late 1943 and early 1944 were heavy with contrails, interlaced streaks that marked the endless struggle between fortress and fighter. To German civilians in cities like Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin, those lines in the heavens meant only one thing: thunder would soon follow. The Americans were coming, and nothing seemed able to stop them. German Civil Defense Report, Jan 1944. The strategic impact of the Flying Fortress was not just in the bombs it carried, but in the way it refused to die. Every mission returned stories of machines that should have been coffins, but instead became symbols. Crews walked away from wrecks with wings shredded, tails blown apart, and fuselages gutted. Each survival became folklore across air bases, fueling morale. "If that one came back," gunners whispered, "so can we." U.S. Army Air Force's Oral History Project 1945. German pilots, meanwhile, grew weary. Post-war interrogations revealed their frustration. "We aimed for the wings, we tore them away. We aimed for the fuselage, we opened it like a can." Still too many flew on, one Luftwaffe officer recalled in 1946, U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The psychological toll was immense. Where once the Luftwaffe believed in surgical destruction, now they saw American bombers as beasts of burden that absorbed pain without end. Strategically, this resilience reshaped campaigns. The 8th Air Force's ability to continue daylight bombing, despite staggering losses, depended on the fact that many fortresses made it home when other bombers would not. Each damaged B-17 that returned kept 10 trained men alive to fly again. This preserved not just aircraft, but irreplaceable human capital. Veteran crews who grew sharper with every mission. Survival multiplied experience, and experience multiplied effectiveness. U.S. Army Air Force's Statistical Digest, 1945. The effect rippled outward. German cities once thought too distant or too heavily defended now fell within the Americans' grasp. Factories in Schweinfurt, refineries in Merseburg, shipyards in Kiel, all came under the relentless hammer of bombing raids. By 1944, American air power had crippled German ball-bearing production by more than 50%, forcing desperate rationing across the Reich. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Industrial Effects Report 1945. Each mission was costly, but the ability of fortresses to keep flying made the strategy viable. At the human level, this resilience was not only an engineering miracle, but also a triumph of logistics and labor. Tens of thousands of factory workers across America bent steel, riveted panels, and tested components. Entire supply chains stretched from Pittsburgh steel mills to Kansas assembly lines, ensuring that damaged bombers could be repaired or replaced with astonishing speed. Ground crews in England, often working ankle-deep in mud, cannibalized wrecked fortresses for parts, patching others overnight to return them to the skies. War Production Board Logistics Review, 1944. For German engineers, the B-17 became an obsession. They dissected wreckage from crash sites, puzzled over redundant systems, and tried to calculate how much punishment the airframe could truly take. Yet each analysis returned to the same conclusion. The Americans had not built for elegance, but for survival. Where German aircraft emphasized speed and maneuver, the fortress embodied brute endurance. It was not meant to evade death, it was meant to endure it. Luftwaffe Technical Report 1944. This endurance had a profound psychological dimension. To Allied crews, climbing into a fortress was stepping into a machine that gave them a fighting chance. To German pilots, attacking one was a gamble. Would this bomber die like it should, or would it impossibly stagger forward through smoke and fire? That uncertainty gnawed at morale, eroding confidence in weapons and tactics alike. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe's confidence was in freefall. Losses mounted not only among bombers, but among fighters. American escorts, P-51 Mustangs with long-range tanks, joined the formations, turning the skies into killing fields for German pilots. For every fortress brought down, another two returned, and German squadrons bled veteran pilots in battles that no longer seemed winnable. U.S. Army Air Force's Tactical Report, May 1944. The legacy of the B-17's resilience extended beyond the war. Military planners studying the conflict concluded that survivability was as decisive as firepower. The redundancy and ruggedness of the fortress informed the design of Cold War aircraft, from the massive B-52 Stratofortress to modern stealth bombers. The principle was clear. Machines must be built not only to strike but to endure, because in endurance lay strategic victory, U.S. Air Force design doctrine. 1952. For the men who built the bombers, the war was both distant and personal. In factories, women and men who would never see Europe nevertheless bent their lives to the effort. They knew the stories, knew that a properly fastened rivet might mean the difference between a crew's survival and its fiery death. "Every gunner who walks off a damaged fortress is our work made flesh," one Boeing supervisor said in 1944. Their contribution was silent but profound, binding steel and human will into something greater than both. The psychological war was not waged only in cockpits and factories. It played out in the minds of civilians beneath the bombs. To German families huddled in cellars, the howl of approaching fortresses became a sound of inevitability. No matter how many were shot down, more came. To Allied families reading letters from sons who returned on crippled aircraft, the same sound became one of fragile hope, the belief that survival was possible, even against impossible odds. As the Allies pushed into France after D-Day, the fortresses shifted from strategic to tactical roles, blasting German troop concentrations, bridges, and supply lines. Their resilience meant they could fly again and again through flak and fighter fire, delivering not just bombs, but the crushing weight of inevitability. The German army marched to the sound of our bombers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later reflected. Eisenhower Memoirs, 1948. By war's end, more than 12,700 B-17s had been built. Over 4,700 were lost in combat. Yet countless others returned when logic said they should not have. The sight of these crippled aircraft, landing with half their wings gone or entire tails missing, left an indelible image on all who witnessed them. They became symbols of resilience itself, of machines and men refusing to surrender to the laws of destruction. In the cold dawn of the post-war world, one lesson stood above all others. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor, but survival decides victory. The B-17 proved that a machine too stubborn to die could shape the destiny of nations. As one gunner wrote in his diary, watching a fortress land with its wings sheared away, "It should have fallen." But it didn't. And because it didn't, we still have a tomorrow, crew diary, March 1945. And so the Flying Fortress entered legend, not merely as a bomber, but as a testament. A machine that taught the world that endurance, as much as firepower, could win wars.